Today we get to talk about the gods of Polynesia. But before I talk about the gods of Polynesia, I want to talk with you about why we travel. Many of you would probably say we travel now because we can, right? We travel because we have inheritance that we don't want to give away. Ungrateful children, grandchildren, et al. And I will submit to you for your consideration this morning that the reason you travel is to be changed. You're not here to remain the same. You're not here this morning to think the same as when you came in just 5 minutes ago. You're here because you desire to change. And the way we change is to change our perspective. And the way we change our perspective, both literally and figuratively, is by changing our position. At times in our life, we have to shake off the dust from our shoes and wander to foreign places, places that challenge us, places that help us see the world, and in seeing the world differently, we see ourselves differently. And so today I will ask you, despite your religious leanings and beliefs, to consider new perspectives this morning. I'm going to share some things that are going to challenge you. Some of you may not like that. That's okay. If you came to this lecture for answers, you're going to be very disappointed because you will leave ideally with more questions. And that is indeed the mark of a good lecture, if I do say so myself. So let's get started. What is a myth? I would imagine that most of you came in this morning with the idea of a myth being a falsehood or a tall tale or even a lie. And I will submit to you this morning to reconsider that myth is a sacred story that explains the world and our experience of it. The subjects of myth reveal universal concerns throughout human history. What were we before we were born? What became of us? What happens to us after we die and when we die? Is there a life that comes after this one? Where do we come from? Ex nihilo, from nothing? Was there a creator? How did we come into being? And what about the premises of good and evil? Where did those things come from, if they are things indeed at all? Myths tap into a universal cultural narrative. From the Middle East to South American Polynesia, there are myths by the hundreds about great floods, virgin births, and life after death. Many of you who are Christians, Judeo-Christians, are sitting back right now and thinking, no, there's only one virgin birth. I could count on 3 or 4 hands the number of virgin birth stories throughout mythical history. Myths are not fairy tales. They're not always optimistic, and they are often warnings that help us live according to the prescribed social norms, or we will pay the consequences. How do we live in society Before there were laws that governed us, there were myths that instructed us. Myths exist to teach us. There is a message in every myth. They teach us about ourselves and others, and they show us how we should live our lives. They serve more than just folkloric functions of don't do this or don't eat that or be careful when traveling there. Myths are metaphors that help us understand the transcendent. That which transcends our ability to understand can only be understood through myth. Myths help us understand life. They're guidebooks for understanding life itself. They reflect the concepts of transcending duality, that everything has its opposite, man and woman. They cannot exist without each other. Good and evil, light and darkness, male and female. They are the keys to understanding the whole of the human experience. There is fact, and then there is truth. Myth is not fact. Myth leads us to truth. War and peace, introvert and extrovert, light and dark, duality, all of these things exist within us. And so it was at the beginning of mythology, even the gods. Keep in mind that the idea of the Judeo-Christian God, mostly Christian God, of being omnibenevolent, all good, is unique in human history. Almost all other gods were like humans. They were both good and bad. They were curious. They had lusts. They had desires. They were petulant. They were angry. All of these things, the one thing that distinguished them was they had great powers and they could live forever. When we understand that good and bad and all of these dualities exist inside of us, that they don't come from someplace else, they are who we are. To attack another for one's faults is to attack our very nature. To judge one another is to judge oneself. What are the four functions of myth? For those of you who have had an opportunity, and if you'd like to, read Joseph Campbell, The Power of Myth, a wonderful book series that talks to us about the powers of myth and where these myths originated. And Joseph talked to us about the four functions of myth. The first one, the mystical and the metaphysical. Awakening in awe before us, before the mystery of being. What a wonder the universe is. Tonight, if you get a chance to go up on deck, and if it's a beautiful starry night, hold your thumb out to the universe. And that portion, that is the tip end of your thumb, contains in the distance 20 million galaxies. 20 million galaxies. We are in one right now. And in one portion, the size of our thumbnail, there exist 20 million galaxies, and that is in our observable universe. And the universe is constantly expanding. How do we wrap our minds around this even today, knowing what we know? Now imagine the earliest peoples without artificial lights dimming their nights and the star skies, looking up to the heavens and seeing millions upon millions of these bright lights and asking themselves, what are those? Where did they come from? And what do they mean to us? What a wonder the universe is. What a wonder each of us is. Mystical myths help us experience awe, to be aware of ourselves and this incredible universe before us. What does it mean to be a human being? How do we explain the unexplainable? These are the functions of myth. We are social creatures who love to tell stories, and myths are stories that speak of truths, leading us to consider deeper truths. Now, the stories themselves are not true, probably not true, almost certainly not true. But because the story itself isn't true, doesn't mean that it doesn't point us to a truth. It is intended indeed to lead us to truth. I share with you that myth is like a menu. Tonight, when you're in the restaurant and you're holding a menu in your hand, you will not rip off a piece of the paper that says steak or pizza or chicken or salmon and put it in your mouth. There is nothing literal about that menu. It is, however, pointing you to the reality that in the kitchen, there is being prepared for you these things, and that it is indeed possible. Myth is like a menu. It points us to a greater truth. They are the pathways to human understanding, helping us understand what is not easily understood. Myth goes beyond science and religion, attempting to explain the unexplainable through the mystical, leaving us with a sense of astonishment that keeps us engaged and wants us to know more. I love this quote. As the island of our knowledge grows, so do the shores of our ignorance. The boundary between the known and the unknown. Learning more about the world doesn't lead us to a point closer to any given final destination, but only to more questions and mysteries. We should die filled with doubt. It is only the fool who dies with answers. Mystical myths tell of gods and mystical beings that personify nature or unexplained forces. In some myths, the sun is personified, and other myths might include talking animals. Talking animals, you say. What myths could those be? Aboriginal Dreamtime, or perhaps the Garden of Eden, the talking serpent. Polynesia, Maui, and the running sun. The second type of myth is called a cosmological myth. Where do we come from? When we look around at this great ocean that we're on. How did this ocean come into being? When we see volcanoes and mountains, great whales, where did these things come from? It helps us, these types of myths help us understand the physical phenomena that surrounds us. The universe is unfathomably huge, inexplicably scary, and perplexingly mysterious. It is so enormous that we can scarce wrap our minds around it. It lies beyond our ability to understand it. So how do we explain it? How did the earliest people among us explain it? Before science and before religion, we created stories that helped us bring into our world meaningful, understandable focus. Cosmological myths are at the heart of most cultures. I won't be traveling with you all the way to Australia, but one of my favorite cosmological myths is from the Gagaju tribe of the Northern Territory of Australia. And it tells about the beginning of time, and there was only darkness. And the great iguana, and the great emu, and the great lizards, great goanna, were gathered around a fire. And they were building this fire, and the great goanna threw on top of the fire a large log. They were trying to light the night, but the goanna threw this big log onto the fire, and it sent up sparks. And these sparks went up to the sky and pierced the fabric of the night, allowing the light to come through, that which we know today as stars. What a beautiful myth that they created to help them understand the stars of the night sky. You will find stories like this that punctuate almost every native culture, and indeed even our modern religions today. Going back to the ancient Greeks, Hesiod's Theogony describes the origins and the genealogies of the Greek gods. The Genesis creation story, the Hebrew Torah and scriptures, talks about creation and our role in the universe and our flawed nature. All in one story, it gathers all of these things together. And as we approach Hawaii now, we'll learn about the story of Pele, the goddess of volcanoes, who helps us understand the explosive nature of volcanoes and of women. Not joking. You can't even make these things up, honestly, although someone did. Cosmological myths help us make sense of the nothingness, ex nihilo, from which we come. Problems, however, arrive when we cling to the literal story instead of the intended truths of these myths. As it is today with religion. When we read stories and we expect them to be literal truths, what we do is we trap ourselves in the minutia of a story that had far greater truths to be shared. And we focus on the words and the significance by tearing apart, say, a biblical verse, which was never intended to be. These were stories. The verses came to us in the 1500s. Before that time, these Bible verses were all told as full stories. And today we break these Bible verses apart and we take one line and we share it as though it has some meaning to us. And I would say to those of you who do that, take apart Mozart's Requiem. Take one line and give it meaning. It has no meaning without the rest of the music. And so it is with all of these stories. They're intended to tell us greater truths. The third type of myth is a sociological myth. This is to validate and support the social order. Each of the societies that created these myths had social structures that they wanted to enforce, and they used myths to create social order. Myths are bound to a place, a people, and a time. Problems, however, occur when we remove these myths from their original context and take them as literal truths. The stories that were written 2,500 years ago for Bronze Age shepherds in the Middle East do not necessarily bear the same context for us in modern day. They're helpful to communicate certain ideas, but we must continually create new myths that help communicate the new social mores that we live by today. What are some Western cultural myths? Adam and Eve, the creation story, Noah's Ark. These myths teach us certain ideals that we are separate from and have dominion over nature. Remember the part in Genesis where it says, "And you shall have dominion over the land and all creatures." You might be surprised to know that that's a mistranslation. It doesn't mean dominion at all. It means stewardship. Consider the difference between the word dominion and domination and stewardship, and how that one mistranslation has led to where we are today. We have authority and are the pinnacle of creation. Well, there's no such reference to that in the Hebrew Scriptures, except that we must, as the head of creation, care for all of those who are within our care. That's a very different idea from domination and dominion. How has this impacted the world around us? Another good example of a myth that upholds a misbalanced culture is the Pandora's box myth. Now, I will share with you that the Adam and Eve story was likely written, the first 5 books, the Pentateuch of the Hebrew Scriptures, were written about 500 to 600 BC. They're called the Mosaic books because they were thought to have been written by Moses. In fact, they were written by several different authors. However, the myth of Pandora comes to us 3 centuries early, from 800 BC. And the idea of Pandora, for those of you who aren't familiar with the story, is that Prometheus stole fire from the gods and brought it down to earth. And so Zeus, to punish Prometheus and his family, created a woman, Pandora, and gave Pandora to Prometheus' brother, Epimetheus. And along with this gift of the woman, she carried with her a vessel. It's called a box today, but it was actually a vessel. And this vessel had inside of it all of the pestilence, anger, misery, and misfortune of the world. And Zeus said to her, "Don't open that." And what did she do? She opened it. Shame on you, ladies. And that's the intended consequence. To place blame for all of the misfortune, for all of the pestilence and the anger in the world on a woman's shoulders. However, keep in mind that what was left behind before Pandora was able to quickly close the lid, one thing remained inside: hope. And so it is also through woman that we still have hope. It's a wonderful story that was meant to uphold an imbalanced social order, a patriarchal social order. And this story, through Greek culture, spread throughout the world and throughout that region, and elements of this you can hear in the Hebrew creation story itself. Many cultural myths uphold unhealthy beliefs. It's our responsibility to look at them and to not assume that the people who came before us knew better. We only arrive at truth through doubt. Science doesn't seek to prove something by proving it. They prove something by seeking to disprove it. It is through doubt that we find truth. The fourth type of myth is the pedagogical myth. How do we live? What are the guides that can help us live our lives? They touch upon themes that never change: love and revenge, mortality and immortality, knowledge and stupidity, motherhood and fatherhood, and more. This is the ideas of extremes as well. Male motherhood. What? Male motherhood? This is not a new concept to us. Nope, going all the way back to giving birth. Zeus gave birth to Dionysus from his thigh. Yahweh creating Adam and then creating Eve from Adam's rib. Virgin mothers and immaculate conceptions. These are all remarkable stories that go against nature itself. Pedagogical myths help to shape individuals to the aims and ideals of a particular social group or tribe. They tell us how to live our lives. They guide people through their lives and help create meaning. The 10 Commandments, Buddha's Eightfold Noble Path, and the Sermon on the Mount. These are all stories that are meant to help guide us to live proper lives. The life of Abraham and Moses, the teachings of Muhammad, the wisdom of the Buddha, the parables of Christ, and even the lessons of Maui, the Polynesian demigod, all hold deep wisdom for us in how to live a sensible and meaningful life. Myths and religions, again, I'm going to beat this into you. They reflect a people, a place, and a time. When we remove these stories from the people, the place, and the time, they lose meaning. And it is our responsibility to seek the truth of these people who wrote it. How do we understand them and what they intended? We have been conditioned to believe that a myth is untrue, but anything mythical is a fib or based altogether on fictional events, that a myth is make-believe. However, by understanding myths, we have an opportunity to better understand ourselves, our faith, and our history. Let's not ask whether or not a myth is true, but whether or not it speaks of a truth. Does it point to a truth? And so today I ask you, as I share with you these stories, to listen with open ears, open minds, and open hearts of a believer. Let your skepticism, like you're watching a movie, take the day off and suspend disbelief for a period of time and try to understand these myths as the earliest people who first created them. Consider that yesterday's religion is today's myth. And I hate to break it to you, but today's religions will inevitably become tomorrow's myths. Let's focus on the truths of these stories that bind and strengthen us. There are many, many gods of Polynesia. They are a polytheistic society. And people prayed to the gods for the same reasons that we pray today. For health, for safety, for prosperity, for a good harvest. My family came from farmers, and we would always, at the beginning of the season, pray for a good harvest for all of my uncles. For all of us traveling, for safety at sea. They prayed alone and they prayed together as communities. Their offerings and their sacrifices were meant to please the gods they believed contributed to the minutiae of their lives. Ancient Polynesians created wonderful tales of their gods and their interaction with these gods. These myths help explain the landscape that surrounded them. There was Pele, the goddess of Hawaii's volcanoes, demonstrates the explosive damage that can come from a woman's temper. This myth personified the power of the volcano as a woman to relate this destructive element of nature to their lives in a personal way. Blatantly sexist, Pele, the volcano goddess, was a woman because of her explosive temper that destroyed everything around her. Male storytellers could better explain how she erupted out of fury, unpredictable, impulsive, and given to sudden rage and violence. But Pele also had power. As a woman, she was able to create new land, as only a woman can do, giving birth to new islands. This understanding was also acceptable to women because they had a strong example of the undeniable power of a woman. This is a story of a mystical myth combined with the cosmological myth, helping people see the wonder around them while making sense of these violent volcanoes. By the numbers, there are more than 400,000 gods and demi-gods in Polynesia. And when we get, if I were to continue on with you all the way to India, I would talk to you about Hinduism, which has something close to 33 million gods. And that's a long lecture. These include the deities, the demi-gods, the aumakua, the ancestral gods, and the lesser akua, which are family gods. Each of these had their own realm of influence over some aspect of society. And for those of you who are Roman Catholic right now, I hope that you're running through your mind a list of all of the saints that are responsible for various things in our lives, right? In this pantheon were those gods who had dominion over such themes as war, and others with such dominion over lesser areas such as pigs, or weaving, or hula dancing. Not all gods were worshipped by everyone. Gods varied from place to place and from island to island, which again speaks to us of this idea that religion and these myths are relevant to the people, the place, and the time. Gods also varied according to a person's area of expertise. For example, a canoe maker wouldn't pray to the god of hula. There were, however, some gods that were worshipped by everyone. The big four of Polynesian, Kane or Tane. And you'll hear, so Tane is for most of Polynesia. When you see the K, that's almost always for Hawaii. Ku or Tu, the god of war. Kaneloa or Taneloa, the rule of the land ruler of the land of departed spirits, and then Lono, the god of agriculture. I love this. When you take a look, you understand intrinsically what these people held valuable. They looked at the father of all creation, which was the god of the forest. That's Tane Mohuta. And then you have two, the god of war. Equal to the god of harvest, agricultural rain, and peace, and the land of the departed spirits, war was an intrinsic part of their life. Keep in mind, for those of you who are Christian or Judeo-Christian, that before Yahweh was known as the God of all creation, Yahweh was one of 70 tutelary gods, born of El Elyon and Astarte, the fertility goddess. And he was first the god of metalsmithing, and then he became the god of war. And as the tribe of Judah assimilated all of these other groups unto this tribe, he assimilated all of the other attributes of all of the other gods in the region. And so he started out as the god of metalsmithing, then the god of war, and then in the end, because they had taken over the entire region, Yahweh had become the God of all creation. And so it is now in these areas. Their territories spanned the breadth of Earth's largest ocean and included seas of stars and an endless night sky. Based on the enormity of this world, it's no wonder they were polytheistic. It would be incomprehensible to them that any one God could handle all of these things. They believed in the main gods, but had departmental demigods to micromanage the day-to-day details of every life. For comparisons, I'll say the Catholic Christians believe in one God. This is where it gets fun. Not just one God, though. We say that we're monotheistic, right? Monotheistic, but this God it's triune, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And then Jesus, that's a difficult case because he was both divine and man. And then, of course, we have the saints, right? We talk about being monotheistic, but I would ask you to consider how monotheistic are we when we have saints that do just about everything imaginable. And you pray to God through intercession with these saints. Faithful ask for guidance and protection from the prophets and the saints. I went to a Franciscan high school, and I remembered I believe it's October 6th, we would pray to St. Francis of Assisi, protector of animals. St. Jude, the patron saint of lost causes. Whenever there was someone who looked like they were losing their way, we would pray to St. Jude. St. Christopher, the patron saint of travelers. And then St. Joseph, the patron saint of fathers, workers, and real estate. Now, the ones who are laughing, I know who you are, because you're the Catholics. Because probably you were brought up with when you would sell a house or wanted to sell a house, you would take a statue of St. Joseph and bury it upside down in your front yard. But tell us that we're not idolaters, right? Again, these are attributes that bind us to our very earliest beginnings as polytheists. We say we are one thing, but what we believe in our hearts is very different. I would bet that when we talk about the Aumakua here, the family gods, I would bet that many of you have maybe small shrines in your homes that after a person dies you might light a candle for a while, or special places in your house where you would put photos and maybe stopping by, say a word or two. How many of you will see a red cardinal and talk to a loved one? These are all manifestations of our roots in polytheism. Polynesians had guardian spirits as well. We might call them guardian angels. But a guardian spirit, a ghost, or a totemic creature that they worshipped at the family altar and invoked only as needed. When you're in Hawaii, you will see these kinds of stone platforms. They're called he'iaus. And the he'iaus were places where they would worship. And there are more than 500 of these around the Hawaiian island chains. Again, dramatic evidence of their worship of these gods. Animism. Animism is the idea that comes to us from the Latin word animus, to breathe life. That all living creatures were valuable and precious because they had the life of the Creator. That there was some life in everything, not just the animals, not just people, but every rock, every river, every mountain, every cloud. All of these held the breath of life. Nature was not only live, it was filled with spirit and personality. And that this helped us keep in close contact and protect nature because all things are living and precious. Many significant activities of Polynesian life may be started with a prayer or a religious ritual. In New Zealand, before cutting down a tree, they would do a prayer called a karakia, believing that every tree was the descendant of the father of creation, Tane Mohuta, the god of the forest. The prayer asked for permission to cut the tree and then forgiveness for taking the life. Imagine how different our world would be if before taking the life of anything, we did the same. There must be a necessary purpose behind every act of taking a life, whether a tree, a chicken, or cow, or a human being. This teaches respect and value for people, animals, and for natural resources. A karakia is also used to invoke protection and guidance. They use it also to pray for the dead and for the family of the dead after burial. The missionary Richard Taylor wrote, "Maui have spells suited for all circumstances, to conquer enemies, catch fish, trap rats, and snare birds, to make their kumara grow, and even to bind the obstinate will of a woman, to find anything lost, to discover a stray dog, a concealed enemy, in fact, for all their wants." Their karakias are extremely numerous. Within the 19th century, introduction of Christianity to New Zealand, Maori adopted karakia to acknowledge their new faith. So again, we see a syncretic approach, or syncretism, which is a blending of Christianity with this ancient faith. In modern Maori society, performances of karakia frequently open important meetings and ceremonies. When you go to New Zealand, I especially encourage you to go to a marae, which is the traditional places of the Maori. And when you come there, pay attention. They will start with a karakia, with a prayer, and it will be a song. And they will drop an item that needs to be picked up by another person who is a representative of your group. These are all traditional ways that the Maori still use today. I'm going to share with you the Maori creation myth of Ranginui and Papatuanuku. And this is a two-part myth, and it might be a little bit difficult to understand with the accents because it's a very deeply Kiwi Maori accent. But it's interesting to listen to, and I invite you to listen to this story.
Once upon a time, long, long ago, when the land was flat, it was so dark that nothing could be seen. Skyfather and Earth Mother fell in love. In time, they had many children. One day, the children begged their mother and father for a little more room to run and play, but their parents couldn't let go of each other. One of the gods had seen a beam of light whenever his father stretched his arms away from his mother. Tired of waiting, he asked the other gods to help him push their mother and father apart. They all agreed that it would be better to live in the light. But one brother, the god of the winds, didn't want them to part his parents. Overhearing their plans, the god of winds flew up to his father, and whispering softly, he told him. With a hiss and a roar, Father Sky pulled Mother Earth closer to him. Tired of waiting for his brothers to push, one of the gods pushed with all his might, but as hard as he tried he could not separate them. Soon he fell lifeless to his knees. All of Father Sky and Mother Earth's children tried, one at a time, but as the last child fell to his knees, they all knew it was hopeless. All had forgotten Tane Mahuta, god of the forest, father of the birds and insects. He heaved, and very slowly, inch by inch, he forced Skyfather to rise away from Mother Earth. The distance between father and mother became so wide that for the first time all the children were standing and stretching their arms above their heads. However, it was not enough, so Tane pushed his father further up. At last the gods could feel the warmth of the light upon their faces and see each other. The heartbreaking cries from Father Sky and Mother Earth almost made the children want to stop Tane Mahuta. Nevertheless, as Tane gave one last push, all the children were able to finally see the beauty of their mother. The children started to enjoy the new lit land and with all its bright colours of the rainbow. But when their father's tears began to fall, all of the children were scared, because they thought that his tears would never stop and that they would surely drown. So the children pulled on their mother's strong long hair till she rolled over. With her face hidden from her love, she curled up into a ball, and as she did, she created the sea and the lakes out of the tears of Skyfather. In time, Skyfather and Mother Earth forgave their children, but both wished to be in each other's arms again. Mother Earth to this day still sends her love to Skyfather in the morning mist out of the deepest valleys, and Skyfather returns his love to her each day as fresh dewdrops, his sad tears in the night. Unlike his father and mother, the god of wind to this day remains angry. Every time you feel the wind rush across your face, or hear the wind rattle closed windows and doors, it is the god of wind, making sure no one forgets.
So here we see a story that reflects the people of New Zealand, the Maui. What a beautiful story that talks to us about the importance of parents that love each other so much, but that love can be stifling sometimes. And that when a parent is too much for their children, doesn't allow the child to grow, and that this one child pushed up and pushed the parents away from each other. These are valuable lessons that teach us not only about nature, the cosmological myth, but about how to raise children at the same time. That we have to allow our children to see the light, that we have to give them space to grow and to give them a world of their own to grow. This creation story says that when they were finally free, they set about creating all the creatures and the plants of the earth, but they realized that they were all male, so they had to create a female. So, taking clay from the body of their earth mother, they made a figure that resembled themselves and then breathed life into her nostrils. Humanity has descended from this first family. Does this story sound familiar at all? Monotheism versus polytheism. Hebrew is singular. The Hebrew God is singular and creates the world in 6 days. But here, in the Maui creation myth, we have 6 gods who set about creating the earth in 1 day. The breath of life. In the Hebrew scriptures, in the Polynesian creation myth, the woman is formed from clay and life is breathed into their nostrils. Keep in mind the Hebrew creation story is 600 BCE, and the Polynesian creation story could be as old as 1000 BCE to as late as 700 Common Era. And we really don't know because these stories were passed by oral tradition. And much of the stories, because believe it or not, New Zealand, even as the largest island in the South Pacific, was the last one to be populated. And so consequently, we have these stories that are passed through time and are part of our human consciousness. And we would say that Carl Jung had this idea of archetype theory, that there is a story, that these are threads that bind all of humanity since the beginning of time. Christianity had a significant impact on the Polynesian creation story. It's likely that the Polynesians, wishing to appease the Christian missionaries, changed these ideas of their own story. This included a monotheistic supreme being and themes from Genesis about the creation of earth and human life. New supreme beings appeared in several places in Polynesian mythology. In some instances, pre-European traditional gods were elevated to this position. In Tahiti, Tangaroa became God. Tuamotu, Tane Orangi became God. Tangaroa became the devil. In Hawaii, Kane or Tane Tu and Longo became the Holy Trinity. So we see here now, to appease the missionaries, they started to change their faith and to become, it's called syncretism, where these faiths blended together. In other places, supreme beings were altogether fabricated. They had no supreme beings. And yet when the Christian missionaries came, they started to create these new beings to correlate to the Christian beliefs. The practice of claiming that these new beliefs dated from pre-European times became integral to justifying their existence. So they would create stories to say that these gods had always been, when in fact they hadn't been. And as we close out the lecture today, I would like to share with you some stories of Maui, the demigod. Maui is perhaps the most important of all Polynesian demigods and is single-handedly responsible for many of the great feats in the South Pacific. In fact, Maui's fishing expeditions are supposedly what brought many of the islands of the South Pacific to the surface. In fact, the North Island of New Zealand is called Te Ika a Maui, or the fish caught by Maui. Hawaiians so revered Maui that they named one of their islands after this powerful and mischievous demigod. And now I have a story for you about Maui pulling New Zealand from the ocean. So that's the story of how Maui brought up the North Island of New Zealand. My favorite story of Maui is how Maui tamed the sun. Imagine at the beginning of times, the sun raced through the sky so quickly that there was scarcely enough time to grow their crops, to fish, to do their laundry, to dry their laundry, to even have any time at all during the day. The sun would race across the sky and then rest, making the days very short. So one day, the Maui had grown tired of all the people's complaining, and he said, I will take care of this. So Maui created a trap, and he trapped the sun. And when he trapped the sun, he took out his grandmother's jawbone and beat the sun senseless, breaking the sun's legs and its arms so it could no longer race across the day sky. And so, thanks to Maui and his quick thinking, We now have appropriate lengths of day where you can grow your crops, where you can do your fishing, and enjoy the sunlight because Maui tamed the sun. Maui used his grandmother's jawbone to beat the sun. Do we know why? I asked a Maori gentleman one time, and he said, Maui needed to use the strongest bone around. And as any married man can attest, a woman's jawbone never seems to tire, which makes it the strongest bone in the human body. Maui taunts death. Maui is like Loki from the Norse gods. He's responsible for a lot of the fun stories. He would be considered the jokester. Maui came to believe that he could stop death itself, that he could find a way to kill Hinenuitepo, the goddess of death. So now we see another god figure, a demigod, a son of a god, who wants to reverse death. Did I not conquer fire, he says, subdue the sun, and even fish up land from the sea? Maui slapped his chest boastfully. What is death but another adversary to outwit? But as amazing as Maui was, he was also mortal, and he forgot this. The fates gives me no choice but to try to conquer death, even should I die. And so Maui's great and clever plan was to become a caterpillar. And he says, I will become a caterpillar and enter her body and pass out through her mouth, and in so doing, I will end death. And you can imagine where the caterpillar went up. If going out, her mouth was going to end death, coming out, he came into her birth canal, which is where people arrived into the world. Maui approached the goddess and took off his garments until he stood naked before her. He then transformed into a caterpillar and made his way between her legs. The birds that were around him were now bursting with laughter at the sight of Maui and his preposterous scheme. As the sound of the birds' laughter, the goddess awoke. She knew at once what was happening and squeezed her legs together, breaking Maui's body in half. As such, all men continue to tread the dark path to Hinenuitepo to this day. In some translations, the Maui word for the female genitalia is Te Whare o Aitua, or house of calamity. Pele and Kamapua'a. As I close, this is my favorite story about the Hawaiian Islands. In the Polynesian universe, all form was created and distinguished by the pairing of opposites. No story better describes this than Pele, the goddess of volcanoes, and Kamapua'a, the pig god. Kamapua'a was usually in the form of a pig, but he can turn himself into a tall, muscular, good-looking man, wearing a cape to conceal the pig bristles that grew down his back. As the occasion required, he could also take the forms of various types of fish and plants. His character personifies the nature of a pig, the largest land animal known to the Polynesians. The term male chauvinist pig is definitely accurate when describing how Kamapua'a treated the women around him. When Pele and her sister couple were traveling on the windward side of the island, they were seen by Kamapua'a. Aroused by the sight of Pele, he pursued her. He went to woo her, but she scorned him, calling him insulting names. Her taunts led to a furious battle between them. She hurled molten lava at him and chased him into the sea. But he turned himself into a fish, the huma huma nuka nuku apua'a. Let's say that 3 times fast. Huma huma nuka nuku apua'a, whose tough skin protected him from the boiling heat when Pele's lava poured into the sea. That fish exists and it lives all around the volcanic vents around Hawaiian Islands. So we see these stories now that come up. The demigod, the hero or demigod is often the secret son of a chief who lives as a commoner. At some point in the story, his royal blood is revealed and his magical powers are explained. Maui is revealed this way. Compared to Jesus, the Son of God, living as a commoner, it is in the miracles in Jesus' death and resurrection that we discover his divinity. Kupua, Polynesian superheroes. Many Polynesian mythical heroes are Kupua, people with supernatural powers. We have stories of dogmen, ratmen, birdmen, sharkmen, and even hogmen. This plays today even in our society. Batman, Aquaman, Superman, these are all examples of mythological creatures at play as superheroes in our world today. From the beginning of the human experience, the human mind has kept a record that is etched in the subconscious of every person. As civilizations have spread, the stories of our beginnings and the ways we explain our place and our surroundings are familiar because we all draw from the same well of consciousness, only differentiated by our environments. Our faiths and our gods reflect our environments, the time in which we live, how we perceive ourselves, and how we perceive our gods. To those at the dawn of civilization, God was perceived through the elements of nature, through the sun, the moon, and the stars. As we became more interdependent, God was perceived and took on the form of demi-gods and prophets. For Christians, that revelation comes through Jesus, the prophets, and the saints. For Islam, it was Muhammad and his revelation. For Jews, Moses, the prophets, and the Messiah that is yet to come. Our faiths continue to change and evolve, reflecting what? The people, the place, and the time. May we choose our narrative well to ensure that our stories reflect truth, kindness, and shared respect for all. Thank you.